Well, good evening, everybody, especially those watching online. Hello, everybody out there. I hope that you're having a wonderful evening. All the folks here are having a wonderful evening, aren't you? All right. I mean, how do you have 18 degrees and then 78 degrees within 2 weeks of one another? But, that's well, it's pretty close to that's what it feels like. Oh, my gosh. So, it's a little strange, but here we are, persevering our way through. No more, we didn't have to worry about broadcasting just from my office. It was so funny because I got great feedback from my office, Braden, who's in the back, that people could see Braden lurking in the kitchen making snacks during that broadcast. So Braden's back there behaving. Right, Braden? Yep, there he is. No more snacks tonight. Giving folks a moment to get settled in here. Thanks to all of you that are online. I suppose, well, I know for certain that Garrett has already uploaded the pages for tonight. Would that be correct? So you have those if you're watching online. We have a lot of ground to cover tonight, but you'll be thrilled to know, some of you will, that we're out of the mystical madness of Genesis 1 through 11 and on to a little more practicality. And Caden looks great in his uniform tonight. Let's give it up for Caden, who is a ranger at Topsail, by the way. So Topsail is one of this community's greatest treasures, I think, and Caden's out there protecting it. Good to see you tonight, Caden. Didn't mean to embarrass you, but that's his revenge for playing. He and Garrett were playing share when we came in Sunday morning before church started. That's right. All right, let's get right to our quiz tonight. Even if you've just got here and are just looking at it, you still have an opportunity to respond. The word Lucifer, used once in the book of Isaiah, literally means what? Light bearer. Light bearer. Most specifically, it refers to Venus rising. Number 2, what apocryphal book, that is a book not included in the official Bible, has more to say about Satan than the entire Old Testament combined? The book of Enoch. And that's a shout out for Tim Riles out there, who I hope is watching. It's his favorite non-biblical book, he says. You'll have to ask him about that. 3, when the sons of God paired with the daughters of earth, according to Genesis 6, what race did they produce? The Nephilites or the Nephilim. Either one of those will work. Number 4, the J source, which is the Yahweh source, includes what addition to the animals coming 2 by 2 into Noah's ark? Birds and clean. Clean animals and birds were gathered in what number? 7. Exactly right. And that's some foreshadowing of the Mosaic law yet to come, that they would be concerned with the clean animals long before the law is even instituted. Number 5, Gilgamesh, ancient Babylonian sources say, was the king of the city of Ur, or Iraq, which sounds a whole lot like Iraq, which is the exact territory that we're discussing. Utnapishtim, the Babylonian Noah, gives what reason for the gods sending the flood upon the earth? The gods were being kept up at night. That's exactly right. Humans were being too noisy. Good reason. That's right. I was going to say, anybody that's ever had small children understands. Number 7, after the flood, how many times did God vow not to destroy humanity? He said never, but he said it how many times? 8 times. Whoever that came from. I don't know who said that over here to my right. 8 times. 8. Number 8, which of Noah's sons became the direct ancestor of Abraham? Shem. That's exactly right. Number 9, the venture to reconcile the righteous and loving goodness of God with the injustice and evil of the world, permitted by God, is called a what? Oh, a theodicy. We talked about that last week. It's probably in your notes. A theodicy. And then number 10, besides Genesis, what Old Testament book is most focused on God's goodness and the problem of evil? The book of Job. That's exactly right over here. The book of Job. takes on the theodicy and the problem of evil. So a few questions and clarifications as we begin tonight. I'll move through these fairly quickly. A clarification on a question from Pam Walker about the timing of the book of Revelation. Isn't it interesting that when you talk about the very beginning of things, we want to leap to the very end of things at the same time? The two most likely controversial books in all of the canon, Genesis and Revelation. Revelation by far the most controversial. It was near the end of the session that she asked me that question, and honestly, folks, I was just out of mental gas at that point, and my COVID mind could not conjure up the correct answer, so I have it for you tonight. The book of Revelation was most likely written during the Flavian dynasty. So I'll give you a little bit of the history right here, even if you're not interested. So Nero is a terribly evil emperor of the Roman Empire. And he burns, the historical sources say, he is the one that set fire to Rome to see it burn. And then when public outcry was not exactly what he expected, he blamed it on the Christians. So he began a very aggressive persecution of Christians. The Apostle Peter, the Apostle Paul would both die in that persecution. He had sent his commanding general, Vespasian, to Jerusalem to quell the Jewish uprising. And while that is going on, Nero dies suddenly. And Vespasian leaves the battlefield with his legions and marches back to Rome and declares himself Caesar. So you have Nero that started this persecution. Then Nero's enforcer becomes Caesar. And the Jewish people and the Christians in the Middle East at that time thought, we're saved. Vespasian left. But Vespasian then sent his son Titus back to Jerusalem and leveled the place. Masada fell, obliterated the Jewish nation. When Vespasian died, that same man Titus, his son, became emperor. And then when Titus died, his little brother Domitian became emperor. So for the last 40 years of the first century, it is a very intensive time of persecution against both Jews and Christians. And Domitian in particular ruled the longest of them. He ruled a dozen years at the end of the first century. And that is really the timing, we think, for the book of Revelation. It's a polemic against the Flavian dynasty, particularly against Diocletian at the time, mid-90s, late 90s of the first century. So that's I couldn't conjure all that up at the end of the session last week. So I took a few minutes to put that together for you tonight. And then the questions that I received this week. Question 1, why didn't the book of Enoch get into the Bible? Great question. It came after the Old Testament. The book of Enoch emerged after the Old Testament was pretty much set in place. It is truly an intertestament book. So it's a very influential book. It's an apocalyptic book. It's a book that got a lot of attention, but there's no weaving of the J source, E source in it. The book of Enoch makes no references to the Torah at all, and that was a big red flag if you were a Jewish composer. And the book of Enoch is obsessed with angels, fallen angels, God's angels, the spiritual warfare thing that's going on. And the Jewish composers of the Old Testament just considered that out of bounds. It was too much. And plus, we've got the Old Testament pretty much. The Septuagint had already been translated. So we've got our scriptures. Thank you very much. We don't need to add anything else to it. And so when the New Testament comes along, because the Jewish community had not brought that into the canon of Scripture, the New Testament authors decided to leave it alone as well. In fact, 2 Peter and Jude both quote the book of Enoch. And both those books barely get into the canon simply because they refer back to the book of Enoch. It's a very good question. And that's the quick summary of that. Question 2, Jesus refers to Noah. Does that mean Jesus believed in a literal flood? Jesus does speak about Noah and the flood in Matthew 24, Luke 17, both apocalyptic messages from Jesus. And he simply says, hey, It will be just like that at the end of days. People will be living their lives, and sudden destruction, though they've been forewarned, will be upon them. And you can really have it either way. Does Jesus believe in the literal flood? Does Jesus refer to a allegorical flood? We don't have enough information there. Question 3. What is the significance of those 7 clean animals taken onto the ark? The clean animals in Jewish law refer to those that can be sacrificed or eaten. Kosher laws show themselves already back that far back at the flood, even though kosher laws had not yet been established. This is part of that J source where they're casting back from the future onto the past. And if you're really interested in that Levitical law of clean and unclean animals, Leviticus 11 and Leviticus 14 for your reading pleasure. Clean animals would have been oxen, sheep, goats, deer, and gazelles. And beyond that, everything else pretty much is regarded as unclean. Question 4. Do you believe that the flood was worldwide? I believe the flood covered the existing world of the known writers. There is massive historical record and writings from Mesopotamia of a flood sometime around 3000 BC and another before that. Both of those involve either the Mediterranean Sea or the Black Sea, of a geological collapse and all that water flooding into the Levant. And so I certainly believe that there was a drastic, massive flood sometime around that period. And then question 5, at the end you ask, was the flood caused by God, or was it a way for the writers to understand what had happened to them? Which do you believe? Well. Thank you for asking. I believe that the story of the flood really is the Hebrew attempt to explain their circumstances. I'm very much with Peter Enns here, that you cannot reconcile the God of Jesus of Nazareth with some of these Old Testament depictions of God. That doesn't mean anybody is wrong. It simply means that the writers are struggling with their own language to make sense of what they have experienced. So that's my position on that, and there are serious theological implications otherwise that I just can't quite accept. But onward we go. Yes, Keith.
Why did the Jews sacrifice animals? And second, why did they stop?
The question Keith has asked is, why did the Hebrews, the Jewish people, sacrifice animals, and why did they stop? That's a question that I'm actually going to address at length next week, but I'll go ahead and give the short answer here. The Hebrews made a massive theological jump for animal sacrifice. Guess what all the other religions were sacrificing at the time? Children. They were sacrificing the firstborn children, not the firstborn animals. And the Hebrew theology about the goodness of Yahweh was, this cannot be right. And they make, in the history of religion, this massive leap to move away from human blood to animal. It's bad for the animal, it's good for humanity. And then once the Jewish temple had been torn down in 70 AD, there was no place to sacrifice. Those sacrifices had to occur in the temple. And so then you get rabbinical synagogue-based Judaism that came afterwards, after the destruction of Jerusalem. They had made this shift once before when the Babylonians had destroyed Jerusalem. And so they suspended all sacrifices during that period because there was no place to make those sacrifices. And since the destruction of Jerusalem, Judaism has adapted to a non-sacrificial religion because there is no place to have those sacrifices. Great question. Great question. We move tonight out of primordial Genesis to practical Genesis. And so many people will shout, hallelujah, glory, amen. to the man called of God, Abraham. This early section of Genesis closes almost exactly as the book of Genesis began. Nothing but chaos. Humanity, out of ego and conceit, had tried to storm heaven and build this siege tower to overthrow God. And God comes down, and as I said Sunday, quoting John Milton, God casts his spell upon the Tower of Babel, and all of creation, tribes and nations are scattered across land and sea. And if you echo back to the first chapter of Genesis and the opening of creation, you might remember that the earth was formless and void, and darkness covered the deep waters, and the Spirit of God hovered across the surface and said, "Let there be light." So when you come to Genesis 12, God is doing the same thing. In the chaos of the nations, God says, "Let there be light," and that light will be a man named Abraham, called out of the chaos, called away from the empire, and this has deep implications for the first readers of the text. Ignore the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, ultimately the Romans. This is not your way. That's their way. It's the way of the world. But we're going to do things differently. And the book of Hebrews in the New Testament sums up Abraham best. In Hebrews chapter 11, the text says, "It was by faith that Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave home and go to another land that God would give him as his inheritance. He went without knowing where he was going. Abraham was confidently looking forward to a city with eternal foundations, a city designed and built by God." That's the contrast between Babylon, Babylonia, and Abraham. And so for the next 15 chapters in Genesis, Abraham will be the main character. In some of the chapters, Abraham is the only character. The Genesis rendering of Abraham can be divided into 4 or so sections. In chapters 11:27 through 14:24, we have the calling of Abraham. We get the background on Abraham's early life a little bit. And it is Yahweh, the God who will become synonymous with the Jewish people, who calls him to create a nation unto God's own. And we have the ups and downs of that initial calling. Chapter 15, God establishes a covenant with Abraham, a promise, a contract made of God's initiative. It's strange, it's a bit bizarre, we'll talk about it, but it happens there in chapter 15. And then beginning at chapter 16, all the way through chapter 22, we have a whole series of crises that Abraham faces. Now, many of these crises are self-inflicted. Some are not. But he accepts the terms that God has chosen him among the nations, and he launches out, and then you have all of these obstacles that come up in the road for all of these chapters. And then the 4th section is the continuity of Abraham. We see that how the promise of the covenant gets handed over to his son Isaac. And that promise continues on into the future, taking us to chapter 25, verse number 11, halfway through the book. And then we'll do a real quick character study of Abraham at the end here if we have time. Let's get right to the calling of Abraham. You will find it, and I have it printed for you, I believe, there in Genesis chapter 11. And we read this. This is the account of Terah's family. Terah was the father of Abram. Now, I will refer to him as Abraham throughout, just for simplification's sake. Abraham is the name that God gave him based on Abram. But just for simplicity's sake, he was the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran was the father of Lot. But Haran died in the Ur of the Chaldeans. What did we say about Gilgamesh? Where was he king? In Ur, Iraq. So Abraham's family is from the same hometown as the legendary Gilgamesh. This is not an accident. This is intentional by the writers. The land of his birth while his father Terah was still living. Meanwhile, Abraham and Nahor both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai. I will be referring to her throughout as Sarah, just again for simplicity's sake. And the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. Milcah and her sister Isaac were daughters of Nahor's brother Haran. But Sarai was unable to become pregnant and had no children. One day Terah took his son Abraham, his daughter-in-law Sarai, and his grandson Lot, and moved away from the Ur of the Chaldeans. He was headed for the land of Canaan, but they stopped at Haran and settled there. So Terah is Abraham's father. We don't know much about him, but he is the one that begins the initial journey out of Babylon, out of Babylonia, out of Mesopotamia, journeying west toward the land of Canaan. Sarai, who I said, who is renamed in the covenant to Sarah, is childless, unable to conceive, and this is extremely important in the Abraham-Sarah story. It's laid out at the very beginning, and it's a theme that will be carried out through Abraham's life. And then we move to chapter 12, and the calling of Abraham gets specific. The Lord had said, notice that past tense, had said. God's already spoken once at some point. And Abraham was a little slow on the uptake. The Lord had said to Abram, leave your native country, your relatives, your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you, make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you, curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you. So Abraham departed as the Lord had instructed, and Lot, this is his nephew, whose father has died, went with him. Note the age. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all of his wealth, his livestock, all the people he had taken into his household at Haran, and headed for the land of Canaan. I have a map for you here to show you a bit of that journey of the Levant. So you see where Ur is. It's on your far right-hand side, way down toward the Persian Gulf. That's that body of water down at the bottom, at the base of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The journey to Haran would have gone straight upriver through Babylon, and at Haran there, they pause and stay for a while. Interesting, that's the same name as Abraham's brother who had died. So maybe it's nostalgia that makes them stick there for a while. Terah will go no further. But then Abraham will leave from there and then move down through Damascus. Salem is the ancient name for, take a guess? Jerusalem. On to Salem, and then he makes a couple excursions into Egypt over the years, but then back to Canaan. So that's the route. And you may look at that and say, well, it sure would have been a lot easier to go straight across. That's the Arabian desert. You do not want to go straight across. That is modern-day Saudi Arabia down there. So that was not a possibility to make that journey. They had to go around. The calling here of Abraham is completely out of the blue. The calling of Abraham is without cause. God chooses. And God chooses to bless Abraham. Abraham did nothing to earn this. He's just living his life like a million other Iron Age farmers. And God comes to him to initiate this covenant. And he says, I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. And this can be taken out of context. I know in the environment in which I grew up in, which was extremely fiery and dispensational. If you were raised as a dispensationalist, you know what I'm talking about. And there was you always take the side of Israel no matter what. Because God will bless those who bless them and curse those who curse them. And that can really be abused. Israel isn't always right. Can I say that? When they're wrong, they're wrong. When they're right, they're right. This is covenant language. If someone becomes your intentional enemy, then yeah, they are as if it were warring against God. If someone is your intentional ally, they have taken your side as God's people. And so that piece of the puzzle there, and when he uses the word blessing, it's a Hebrew word, kadush, which is like a prayer. It's the sanctifying prayer that you might be made at a meal. So when God says, I will bless those, it's like a benediction. Like you're saying grace over a meal is what God is saying here. And then there's this interesting aside as Abraham is moving westward. Genesis 12, beginning at verse number 10. You'll find this interesting. At that time, a severe famine struck the land of Canaan. Okay, so Abraham's made it to the, quote, promised land, but there's no food, forcing Abram to go down to Egypt where he lived as a foreigner. As he was approaching the border of Egypt, Abraham said to his wife Sarai, look, you're a beautiful woman. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Let's kill him so we can have her. So please tell them you are my sister. Then they will spare my life and treat me well because of their interest in you. First of all, this is very, very chauvinistic, right? Okay, Sarah, they may take you, but I'll live. That's kind of the first attitude that gets communicated. And this is not the first time that this is not the only time this will happen. I won't get into all of it tonight. This happens 3 times in Adam and Isaac's story. Abraham and Isaac's story. Abraham does it twice. 2 different occasions, he's going to a foreign land and he says, look, ixnay on the Eif way thing. Don't tell anybody you're my wife. Tell them you're my sister. And then Isaac, his son, will do the same thing because he's married to a beautiful woman. And he commits the same thing. Of course, it never works because somebody sees that the women escape the royal harem and they're out behind the camels, groping one another. It's in the text. Go look at it. And they're like, oh my God, this isn't a sister and brother affair. They're married. And so people say, what is going on? Why the triplicate? Why? It's repeated 3 different times. Are the editors and the writers of Genesis so numbskull that they would just accidentally repeat the same story 3 times? Absolutely not. It's intentional. And it's aimed directly at that post-exile audience because they were terrified that their bloodline and their nation was going to be extinguished. When the Babylonians showed up in Israel and took everybody hostage, they did not say to the men and the women, oh, y'all are married? That's good, we'll keep you together. They raped all the women. And they killed the men who resisted. They were brutal, as colonizing forces are. And then when they deport them to Iraq, there is this existential crisis that the children being born are not actually Jews. They're the children of the invaders. And so there is this fear in the post-exile community of we have to protect the women somehow, but they were chauvinistic, for the sake of future sons. And you have this intricate story taking place of Abraham trying to survive and hide the identity of his wife at the same time for the sake of future children. Does that make sense? Now, if you had been in that community, we would read these stories and get it immediately because of the fear of the race really coming to an end. So I think that's why we see this in triplicate form. You move to chapter 13. It's an account of Abraham and Lot separating, and that foreshadows a lot of drama to come. Chapter 14 is this great tribal battle. Lot gets into trouble. This is another message for the post-exile community. Lot keeps wandering off. in the story of Genesis. Now, this is Abraham's nephew. And if you've ever had a nephew or I won't say anymore right there. He's one of those nephews. That's all I'm going to say. And he keeps wandering off and gets pulled away further and further from Abraham. And this is a message to the post-exile community. Look, you can't do that. You've got to stick together. If you wander off, you're going to get absorbed and pulled away, and you're going to lose your standing. You're going to lose your life. A part of our even very nation is going to get assimilated into more evil powers. Stick together. Stick with Father Abraham is really the message that's being said here. But Lot keeps wandering away. In chapter 14, Abraham gets a tribal army together, and there's this massive battle. But then at the end, he has this strange encounter with a character named Melchizedek. And I think you have the scripture for you there. Do you have that there? Genesis 14. Melchizedek, the king of Salem and a priest of God Most High, brought Abram some bread and wine. Melchizedek blessed Abram with his blessing. Blessed be Abram by the God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has defeated your enemies for you. And then Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of all the goods he had recovered. This is a strange paragraph. Melchizedek will get mentioned a few more times in the Old Testament, and then Melchizedek will get mentioned in the book of Hebrews. Strangely enough, being compared to Jesus, a priest after the order of Melchizedek. What really makes this interesting is that Melchizedek, when he calls God the God Most High, he uses a unique name for God called Elyon, God Most High, and it is a Canaanite God. It is not Yahweh. It is a name for God that the Canaanite tribes used. But Abraham did not let that bother him. He took the blessing and then gave back a tithe to Melchizedek. And it becomes obvious that the curators of Genesis are making, number one, Salem and Jerusalem very important here because it will be the future capital of the Jewish people. They're making Melchizedek important because he recognizes God's power on Abram. And it sets up some parallels that will go forward throughout Jewish history. It's very, very interesting. That is the calling of Abraham. And just like that, we move 5 chapters when it's taken us 5 weeks to move 11. Questions? Right here first, and then coming to you, Keith. Go ahead.
When you see these passages that say the Lord said and spoke, how is that to be taken?
That's a good question.
Literally, he's speaking to them, or is this some mystic thing where he's just dreaming and all of a sudden
It's
says God speaking to him?
it's a good question. The question is for those online, when you see these places where the Lord spoke, the Lord said, how are we to take that? Mystically, a dream, literally? I think, Mark, we have to kind of combine all those, because as we go through Abraham's story, there's obvious times he's having a mystical experience. When he makes the covenant in Genesis 15, it's a dream experience. And then Abraham has a literal face-to-face experience with 3 visitors. So it's mystical in the sense that we can't explain it all, but it's multifaceted. There's never just like one single way that it comes to the surface. It's a very good question. Keith?
Where does the Old Testament and the Quran deviate? Doesn't Islam believe in Abraham?
The question is, where does the Old Testament and the Quran deviate? Doesn't Islam believe in Abraham? Yes, they do. We're coming to that exact question in about 10 minutes. And back to the back.
We have a few online questions from our online audience. And the first one is, does God come to Abraham in a dream?
Well, okay, I just answered that one.
Okay, perfect. And then why was Abraham chosen out of all humanity?
I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. That really foreshadows the theology of the Apostle Paul, and the theology of the Jewish people. And they would answer that there is no real good reason why Abraham was chosen. It was an act of God's grace.
And
And that has massive implications on Christian theology when you get to Ephesians, Romans, and Galatians.
lastly, was Sarah a good bit younger than Abraham?
She's a decade younger. So she's on Social Security before she's had her baby. I credit that from Max Lucado. Max Lucado said that Sarah was the first person to pay her paternity bills with Medicaid. So
Sarah was really Abraham's half-sister, so he half-lied.
he did half-lied. You're right. There's a lot of incestual stuff that's going on in these chapters as well.
But he did use both his wife and his sister.
He did. The question is, why would saying she's my sister stop anybody? It's all, again, bound up in the honor culture of the day. They would kill a husband. Abraham's not guarding her. He's guarding him. And so they would kill a husband because of the vows taken. They wouldn't kill a brother. And so Abraham is... as part of the character study of Abraham, he is a heroic figure. That does not mean that he is not without his massive flaws. Which I love that about Abraham in this sense, that if you're looking for propaganda, don't read the story of Abraham. Because if it was propaganda, they would have Abraham looking great on every page. And honestly, he looks awful on more than one occasion. And that goes back, Garrett, to the question, why choose him? It's an act of grace, and there can't be any other explanation for it. Yeah. Good questions. Let's real quick talk about the covenant. It's only one chapter. You know, all this wandering around in Canaan and Egypt and making deals with trying to keep Sarah secret and all this stuff. We get to the covenant. It's Genesis 15, one single chapter. It gets reaffirmed in Genesis 17 and 22. But this is the major covenant. It's the second recorded covenant in the Bible. The first was with Noah, when God said, I'll not destroy humanity again. And now we become much more specific here with Abraham. Verses 1 through 6. Sometime later, the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision and said to him, here's the vision, Mark, right to your question. Do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you, and your reward will be great. But Abram replied, O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? Great question. Because all of God's promises are dependent upon an heir. You're going to be a great nation. I don't even have a kid. I don't have a child. And then he says, Eleazar of Damascus, which is the closest servant in his household, will inherit all my wealth. You have given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants will be an heir. And then the Lord said to him, no, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir. And then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, beautiful passage, look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have. And Abraham, this has major New Testament implications, this one verse. Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith, not because, certainly, of his character. So this is that official Abrahamic covenant. The rest of the chapter, if you were to read it, and if you want another strange chapter, go read it. God creates this covenant with Abraham, and to Mark's question, it begins as a vision and it ends as a dream. God says to Abraham, we're gonna strike a deal. Do you remember when you were a kid and you watched the old westerns, and they would the Native American chief and the cowboy would strike a deal? Do you remember what they would do? Well, they would smoke the peace pipe. Do you remember they would cut their hand and shake? How absolutely unsanitary as that in our day and time, right? They'd cut their hand and they would let the blood go together as a blood oath. Well, Genesis 15 has a version of that. Noah takes all these clean animals and cuts them in half and lays them out open. This is an ancient ceremony that would have been practiced in the Levant, for centuries. And then what would happen if two kings or two tribe leaders were making a deal? They would cut the animals in half, and then they would both walk between them and say, as we have cut these animals apart, by us walking between them, we are binding them back together as we are bound together in this promise to each other. It sounds strange, but that's how they did things. In this dream, Abraham falls asleep as the animals have been cut open, and it is God Himself in the vision of a torch that walks between the animals in that weaving act, so that God takes on all the responsibility of the covenant and says to Abraham, you just keep believing, and I will uphold the deal that I have made with you. It's a strange, bizarre scene. It's very foreign to our Western minds, but it is a very good one. Note verses 17 and 18. Do you have that printed? Okay. After the sun went down and darkness fell, Abram saw a smoking firepot and a flaming torch pass between the halves of the carcasses. So the Lord made a covenant with Abraham that day. And then again, it's credited to him as righteousness. And this is why Abraham plays such an important role in the Apostle Paul's theology of salvation and grace. Salvation is something that God does by grace. Our role is to simply believe it and live it. Paul would say, for by grace are you saved through faith. It is a gift of God. That doesn't spring out of a vacuum. That is a Jewish man indoctrinated in Abrahamic covenant theology, bringing that to the new world of Christianity and saying salvation is God's responsibility. God comes to you and offers. Your only responsibility is to believe and to follow. And it's rooted all the way back here in Genesis. And that is how Christians claim Abraham as father. It's not a genetic connection, it's a theological connection. The theology of Abraham is the theology of the Apostle Paul in the New Testament. Quick questions? All right, let's move quickly, and we're going to have to move quickly. How does time move so fast on Wednesday nights? We're going to talk about the crises of Abraham, and they are plural properly. Chapter 16, Sarah loses faith, she loses patience, and she proposes to Abraham that he take her Egyptian servant girl Hagar as his concubine and impregnate her and produce your heir through her. And Abraham said, you want me to have sex with this younger woman? And she said, yes, I do. And he said, well, somebody has to, I guess. And he did. And after this happens, Sarah has a little bit of a buyer's remorse and says, no, I don't think this is a good idea at all. I need you to get rid of her. And they run her away into the desert where God finds her and says, no, I'm going to make a great nation out of your offspring as well. Go back home. She invents a name for God that we have never heard before. You are the God who sees me is the name that she uses, very unique in the Old Testament. And God sends her back, and that's crisis number 1. Chapter 17, a very strange chapter again. God reaffirms His commitment to Abraham, and why not after Abraham and Sarah have thrown a spanner into the works here by introducing Hagar into the situation. And in verse 18 of chapter 17, Abraham says to God, may Ishmael live under your special blessing. And to Keith's question, Muhammad and his followers would say right here, yes, yes indeed. Abraham is our genetic ancestor as well as our spiritual ancestor. Muhammad connected Islam with Ishmael. There's where it deviates, at the first place that it deviates. Jews, Christians say Isaac, who we haven't even talked about yet, is the son of promise. Islam says Ishmael is the son of promise, and why not? He is the firstborn. And this rivalry that is thousands of years old was introduced early on in the text. And that's a crisis unto itself. I don't really have time to talk about circumcision. I'll skip that slide. Garrett is so disappointed back there. Circumcision is the mark of God's covenant with Abraham. And that takes some courage for a nearly 100-year-old man to circumcise himself and all of his family. I'm going to skip that to chapter 18. God visits Abraham once again in triplicate. I've got a picture for you here. This is called the Trinity by Andrei Rublev, painted in 1411. And it depicts Abraham's visitors coming to him in his tent. It's a beautiful icon, by the way. Andrei Rublev called this the Trinity. The Old Testament doesn't call it that. God shows up in Abraham's tent to reaffirm the promise of Isaac. And this is in chapter 18. Look at verses 1 and 2 and verses 13 and 14. I think you have it printed for you. One day, Abraham was sitting at the entrance to his tent during the hottest part of the day. He looked up and noticed 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he ran to meet them and welcomed them, bowing low to the ground. And then you jump forward to later in the story. Then the Lord said to Abraham, this is really strange. They show up in 3, and then 1, they speak as 1. If you could see the Hebrew syntax, it's bizarre. And then they go back to speaking as 3. Mark, your question is so spot on. Is it vision? Is it literal? It's something. And it's definitely an experience that warranted, this one chapter 18, would merit an hour unto itself. There's a lot going on right here. But then the Lord said to Abram, why did Sarah laugh? Because the Lord had said to Abraham, you're going to have a son next year this time. And Sarah is behind the curtain listening to everything that's going on. And she goes, because she's 90 years old. And the Lord says, why is she laughing? And so Isaac means laughter. That's the name of the meaning of Isaac. And he would be born a year later. Chapter 18 also includes another crisis unto itself of Abraham playing this tug-of-war with God over the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. You talk about some chutzpah right here. God says, so 3 people show up to speak to Abraham in the tent. 2 keep going to Sodom and Gomorrah. God stays behind. And God says, I'm going to wipe out Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham says, verse 25 of 18, surely you wouldn't do that. Should not the judge of all the earth do what is right? Now that's very Hasidic Judaism right there. They love to fight with God, wrestle with God. They get it after Abraham. You can't do that. And so God says, well, if I could find 50 good people, I wouldn't do it. And Abraham says, how about 40? And God says, okay, 40. Well, how about 30? And Abraham gets him all the way down to 10. And they can't find 10 righteous people in all that, in all that land. Sodom gets wiped off the face of the earth only after Lot narrowly escapes. If you read chapter 19 of Genesis, go read it on your own. It is rated R by the Motion Picture Association. The 3 visitors to go on to Sodom, God apparently ascends back to on high. Abraham's bumbling nephew, Lot, here we are trying to rescue him again, sending that message to the post-exile community. A mob forms. They want these visitors for themselves. Lot does the unthinkable to protect the divine agents. He offers them his daughters. Don't rape these men. Here are my daughters. What is going on with these men in Genesis, right? And the angels, the angelic forces there, There's lightning bolts and blinding. They get Lot and his family. They get them out of there, and then fire falls. And there's always been this question of what is the sin of Sodom. There are a few choices here, and you might want them all. Some say it's a sexual sin based on the mob who showed up at Lot's door, and we would have to also say based on Lot's own actions with his daughters. Isaiah 1:3 call the sin of Sodom corrupted leadership, comparing Jerusalem to Sodom. Ezekiel gets right to it in chapter 16. He says, "As surely as I live, says the sovereign Lord, Sodom and her daughters were never as wicked as you and your daughters. Sodom's sins were pride, gluttony, and laziness, while the poor and needy suffered outside her door. She was proud and committed detestable sins, so I wiped her out, as you have seen." And then Jeremiah 23, speaking again of Jerusalem, he says it's bad religion. They commit adultery and love dishonesty. They encourage those who are doing evil so that no one turns away from their sin. These prophets are as wicked as the people of Sodom and Gomorrah once were. Therefore, this is what the Lord of Heaven's army says concerning the prophets. I will feed them with bitterness and give them poison to drink, for it is because of Jerusalem's prophets or preachers that wickedness has filled this land. And then Jesus would speak of Sodom and Gomorrah as well and make a very bold statement and said, "It will be better for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than the cities in which I have preached to. For if the miracles that I have done were witnessed by the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have repented, and you won't." So it's a very powerful statement. In Genesis 20, the crisis continues. Abraham pulls that trick again, hiding his 90-year-old pregnant wife's identity so that he won't get killed. And then finally, we get to Genesis 21 and Isaac is born. But as it goes with Abraham, this produces a little more than jealousy with Sarah. And Sarah decides again, you got to get rid of Hagar and Ishmael. And so Abraham complies and runs them into the desert, and they will never live with Abraham again. God once again finds them in the desert and says, "Don't be afraid, I will sustain you." And God rescues them. And then in chapter 22, the greatest crisis of all, God challenges Abraham to sacrifice Isaac on a burning altar. This is called the binding of Isaac in Judaism. And I'm not going to talk about that tonight. I'm going to hold it for next week because it is the central event in Isaac's life as we move to Isaac next week. Mark.
I'm curious in one of these chapters, but the verse always refers to, I love Esau, but I hated Ishmael before he got. So what's your interpretation of that?
I think that actually occurs a couple times in comparison with Ishmael and Isaac, and then in comparison to Isaac and Esau. I'm sorry, the question was, in the biblical text, it's sometimes said, I loved Isaac, but I hated Ishmael, or I loved Israel, Jacob, and hated Esau. It's a repeated couplet. And it again speaks to the writers, the collectors of Genesis, creating that tribal heart identity. Don't mingle. That's really big, and you'll see in a minute, like when Abraham goes to look for Isaac a wife, he says to his servant, "I want you to go back to Haran, where my father is from, and find a woman there, even if she's kin to us. I do not want him marrying a Canaanite woman." That's the message right there. And that's to that post-exile community. Because the prophets, almost in unison, say, one of the reasons that God has done this to us is you went out and started mingling and marrying with all these other families. And this is what God has done to us as a result. So ritualistic and ethnic purity are a big deal in Genesis. Another good question. Real quick, I'm down to 5 minutes here. Abraham's life comes to an end. His line continues. Genesis chapter 23 there is the story of Sarah's death And Abraham negotiates a burial place for her, the finest burial place that he could find. She dies in Hebron. You may hear that town still named. It's in the West Bank today. You can go to Hebron. Well, I don't know if you can go today, but you used to go to Hebron, and you could see the cave of the patriarchs. And it's actually an Islamic mosque now. There's a picture of it. Inside that building are the graves of Sarah and Abraham, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah, the three great patriarchic families of the Jewish faith. And so we have an extensive chapter about that, because this burial place is so important. Sarah's burial is the first one recorded in the Bible. People die, but she's the first one that they talk about actually having a proper burial. And then chapter 24, as I've already said, Abraham is arranging the marriage for Isaac, and he is emphatic that it not be to a Canaanite. Again, more foreshadowing. And then chapter 25, 1 through 11, the last words, the last days of Abraham. He remarries, has a few more sons, more tribes, more nations. He lives to be 175 years old. So when he left the Ur of the Chaldees and Haran, he was 75. So we just covered 100-year journey of this man Abraham. And he passes the blessing of Yahweh on to Isaac. I think you have it there, Genesis 25, 5 through 11. Abraham gave everything he owned to his son Isaac, but before he died, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them off to a land in the east away from Isaac. Y'all see this, right? Again, this is very much toward the post-exile community. And even the sons that he sends away, he sends them where? Into Mesopotamia, into Babylon. Get away from, even though you're my sons, you got to get away from Isaac. He's the chosen one. And then Abram lived for 175 years. He died at a ripe old age, having lived a long and satisfying life. He breathed his last, joined his ancestors in death, and then he's buried in that same field, the same cave where Sarah was buried. And after Abraham's death, God blessed his son, Isaac. A couple quick things before that final character study and final questions. Abraham's life speaks to the post-exile community in some very clear ways. Number one, he too was called out and away from Babylon, becoming a true Hebrew. I'm going to talk about this Sunday morning, by the way. The meaning of the word Hebrew, if you look at where it came from, it really means outsider. It means one who left the city for the country, which isn't a bad title, I don't think. And sometimes it means troublemaker, a true outsider. So Abraham is the first Hebrew. I'll leave the city, I'll leave this Babylonian civilization, I'll go live out where God has called me. And that's what the people of Israel, that was their calling. 2, God would be the faithful keeper of the covenant. Only belief was required. 3, the future, no matter how frightening, was secure. No matter how many times you thought you need to hide your wife or lie about something, the nation will be safe. And then 4, the community must stick together. So those are, you see these themes in the life of Abraham, and these are directly aimed at that post-exile community who was coming back from Babylon. And then finally, real quick, this character study of Abraham. And what did we say today about Abraham? It's complicated, right? He was faithful. Obviously, you don't leave your family and make this big journey without believing in something. And then at the same time, he was plagued by doubts. God would show up and speak to him, and the first thing he would say is, how? When? Explain it to me. So he did have his doubts, but he believed. It was credited to him as righteousness. He was courageous. He could go to war with neighboring tribes if he had to, and then he could be cowardly, lie, deceit, hiding things. He could be incredibly protective of his sons and of Sarah, and he could be very passive. Oh, you want Hagar to go into the wilderness and die? Okay, whatever you want. You just see it in him, this passive trait that's in there. And then he could be really audacious. I mean, who's going to argue with God? He did and prevailed in many ways. And yet he can't call on that same audacious nature, as we'll see next week, when God says, I need you to kill Isaac. And that audacious negotiating, taking God to task just isn't there in that story. So when it's all said and done, Abraham is just like the rest of us. He's very human, which makes the story in many ways just that much more powerful. He's not a superhero with a cape. He's just a guy. And God chose him to do something very special in the world. Questions?
Abraham's third wife, Keturah, had 6 sons, and they basically settled in Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
You don't hear much about them.
No, you don't hear. You hear about Ishmael and Isaac, but you don't hear about this other half dozen sons whose tribes are named. And as far as their future goes, the writer of Genesis wanted them named, but we don't know really what becomes of any of them. Another person that disappears is Lot. After the whole Sodom affair, I didn't get into it, but after Sodom is destroyed, his 2 daughters say, look, we don't have any prospects left because God killed all the men. So let's get our father drunk and we'll have our children by him. So they get Lot blackout drunk, and their 2 children, their 2 sons, one each, is born out of incest. The Amorites and the Moabites. That's the Jewish theological explanation for where they came from. And Lot just disappears. And that's another message to the post-exile community. Look, if you marry all the Babylonians, you're going to disappear. That's what happened to the northern half of Israel. We talked today about the 12 tribes of Israel. There are no 12 tribes of Israel. 10 of them were destroyed in 700 BC. They were carried off to Assyria. They intermarried with the Assyrians, and they are no more. The only ones left in Israel were called Samaritans. You remember those guys? The Good Samaritans? The Samaritans were the ones who had intermarried with the Assyrians, and they were more hated than the Assyrians because they were half-breeds, for lack of a better word. And so you have this real important, you'll be obliterated if you do this. Yes?
If you had to describe Abraham in 1 or 2 sentences of his role in Christian history, how would you describe him?
So the question again? I'm sorry, you cut out there.
Yeah, that was weird. If you had to describe Abraham in 1 or 2 sentences in the context of his role in Christian history, how would you describe him?
Conflicted, because Paul uses Abraham and the faith of Abraham in one direction, and James uses the faith of Abraham in a completely different direction. So much so that Martin Luther said the book of James is a book full of straw and should be removed from the New Testament. So Abraham is there and has been apparently since the beginning of Christianity to be used as you see him. That does not negate the fact that he is the father of the monotheistic faiths in the world. All faiths that believe in one God stem from Abraham of the Ur of the Chaldeans. Whether it's Jews or Christians or Islam, they all begin right there with him. Which, Keith, animal sacrifice was a revolutionary thing. To believe in a single God was even more revolutionary. The Mesopotamians didn't get there, the Greeks didn't get there, the Romans didn't get there, but monotheism, the Jews were, and Abraham in particular, was very early on in that adaptation for sure, if we were talking about world religions. Other questions? All right, next week, February 12th, session 6, we will pick up with Abraham's son of promise, Isaac. And we will look at that arranged marriage. We will look at the binding of Isaac, and then we will bridge the gap to the next session. Isaac, his wife has twins, Jacob and Esau, and we have another dividing of the road, just as there was one between Isaac and Ishmael, then Jacob and Jacob and Esau split as well, and we'll talk about that next week. All right? Thanks for coming tonight. Y'all have a good one.